competency-based education is coming to Florida. I mean, either you guys will do it or somebody else will do it. It's coming. I'm working with 3 different institutions right now on building competency-based programs. One is a public, one is a private nonprofit, and one is one of the big for-profits. So it is coming, whether you decide to do it or not. So it's important that you understand that what you learn about competency-based education is going to affect what you do in your daily work with students and in competing for students. And if you've looked at the recent report from the National Council on Educational Statistics, we're all going to be competing for students because the statistics say that from now until 2021, enrollment is only going to increase 15%. And if you compare that to what's happened in the last 10 years, it's amazingly different. So, competency-based education is not new. You know, it's new to most of us, and when I was hired at Western Governors, I had never heard of competency-based education. At the University of Virginia, they didn't really talk about competency-based education. That wasn't talked about in higher education. But if you read the literature, I drove up the road to a school called Virginia Tech and went to the library there and pulled some books off the shelves, hadn't done that for a while, to see what they had about competency-based education. And competency-based education actually has its roots back in the 40s, and it was actually started around teacher education programs. People were unhappy with the quality of high school graduates, and so they wanted to improve teachers and make teachers better, and so they came up with competency-based models. So if you ever get the opportunity, you may want to look at that. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of discussion and conversation around competency-based education. What I'm going to do today is kind of dive in a little bit and talk about what you have to do if you want to implement a competency-based program. So we're going to take it to a little smaller. Ooh, I think I better get to the right place here. Oops. Let's see. Kind of hard to do this from the angle over here. All right, let's go. All right. All right. Bob Mendenhall, in an article in September 2012, said the most important characteristic of competency-based education is that it measures learning rather than time. If you get the opportunity, that article is online at the Huffington Post, and I think he does an exceptionally good job of explaining what competency-based learning is, particularly for people who are unfamiliar with competency-based learning, like the faculty members that we were talking about earlier. I'm doing it again. All right, characteristics of competency-based programs. Are you all familiar with backward design? How many of you have done curriculum design using a backward design? Okay, that competency-based programs begin with figuring out what you want students to know and be able to do at the end of the program. They don't begin with what do you want to teach in the class or what textbook does the professor want to use. So competency-based education is backward design. The design is driven by the competencies. The learning and instructional content is built last. First you do the competencies, then you do assessments, then you do the learning content. And it should be tight alignment between the competencies, your assessments, and the learning content. Doing it again. I need instruction on computers, huh? Let's try this. All right. I want to talk about the 4 phases in building competency-based education, and they're really not any different than building any type of educational program. The first phase is planning, and I'm going to go through the steps that are involved with planning. Development, implementation, and evaluation are the four processes and phases. The U.S. Department of Education actually defined what competency was back in 2001. One of the most critical pieces to developing a competency-based program is forming the right leadership team, and I think some of the other presenters talked about that earlier. You have to have the right people on board. You have to have the people who can make decisions and put resources forward to be able to do a competency-based program. That's particularly interesting I think, in large systems, particularly if you have multiple institutions. It's figuring out how you get the right people on board and how you get the information to the right people, the people who make decisions. You also have to identify how are competency-based programs going to interface with your current models and programs. And I think Jay was talking about that some, that you have to figure that out, and people have to not feel threatened by the fact that you're doing some new model and offering new programs. You also have to figure out what the vision and goals are for your competency-based program. You don't want to just offer a competency-based program because that's the hot new thing. You need to make sure how that aligns with your university mission and goals. You also have to do a lot of marketing. You have to do a lot of marketing and communication both internally and externally about what competency-based education means for your institution. You have to figure out how you're going to assess competencies. What type of mix are you going to use? Do you have a test development and delivery platform? And you have to identify what are the roles of the advisory board, faculty, administrators. Western Governors uses a disaggregated faculty model. Not everybody's going to want to use that type of model. One school that I'm working with is not going to use any of their current faculty. They're going to hire all new faculty to do the competency-based model. So you have to figure out what are those roles. And it helps if you figure it out fairly quickly so that you know what you're communicating to faculty, because they're the folks who feel most threatened when you begin to talk about new models. You also need to develop a budget with a timeline. And as Jay found at Kentucky, it takes longer than you think it's going to take. Every curriculum project I've ever worked on takes longer than you think it's going to take. So you need to plan for that. You also need to plan for instructional support. So if you're going to do competency-based, how are you going to work with the students who aren't competent? In my experience at Western Governors, we had students come in who were very competent. So I had a student who actually finished his whole bachelor's degree in 6 months. But the reason he was able to do that was he was very competent when he came in. He had 90 credits from Auburn. He had worked as a financial manager for a church in Charlotte, North Carolina that had both a school and the church, and he was the head of finance for them. So he was a very competent individual. So he was able to move quickly. You have lots of students who aren't competent, so you need to make sure you have the instructional tools for them to become competent. And for those folks, it takes a lot longer. I think the average time to completion at Western Governors now is about 30 months, which is up. Earlier it was, when I was there, I left there in 2010, the average time to completion was 20 months for a bachelor's degree. Competency-based education works really well for people who are competent. They can move quickly. It's when you need remedial support that competency-based education can be quite discouraging for students. You also have to have a strategy for working with your accrediting body. Competency-based education is fairly new for accreditors, and so they're trying to figure out exactly how they ensure that you're doing a quality job with creating a competency-based program. Yeah, this is kind of a neat quote. It came out of an Inside Higher Education article, but it says it flips the relationship between time and what you expect students to be able to know and do. So it's interesting. In the development process, when you decide you're going to do competency-based education, the first thing you have to do is you have to define what's a competent student. What are the competencies that the student's going to have to demonstrate to be able to graduate? Once you figure it out, then you can create your degree structure. The other thing I would say to you with competency-based is not just about what they know, it's also about what can they do, what are their abilities and skills. And we talked about this yesterday a bit. It's about gathering information from employers and going out and interviewing your graduates to find out what are the skills they needed first day on the job and what skills did they not have when they completed your program. So you could create your degree structure. Competency statements are generally very broad statements, and so at Western Governors, every competency statement had a series of objective statements, which were one measurable thing that you measured, and the sum of measuring all those objectives meant that the student had then mastered the competency. All right, there are lots of approvals that have to happen once you get your competencies and objectives in your program design. You've got to get approvals from both the department chairs, the faculty, and possibly administrators, depending on who's in charge of that. Administrators are generally very interested in what the competency-based program looks like because it's new and they want to know what it looks like, and folks are or the public and other higher education institutions are watching what's going on with competency-based education. Then after you get your approvals and you've got your competencies built, then you begin to develop your assessments. And you can either build those internally yourself, or you can purchase those or have those built with the test development folks. Or you might use industry certifications and award credit for industry certifications. At Western Governors, we gave credit for several IT certifications and also credit for the Society for Human Resource Managers, the PHR certification. We get credit for that. So there are some ways to leverage professional certifications to give credit. You also, then finally, you would begin then develop your learning content. So that's when you would then get your faculty or your subject matter experts to begin to get your learning content together. Or perhaps you might work with a learning content provider who would build the learning content for you. Okay, in the implementation process, there are several things that you have to do, and all these systems have to work together. So you're going to publish your learning content, and you may be using a learning management system for that content. You may have your own internal. When I was at New Charter, they were building their own internal system for publishing their learning content. Step 2, you would have to publish your assessments. Now with assessments, there are considerations around originality and security, keeping your exams and projects secure. So you would have some other implications for that. Typically your assessments with the schools that I've worked with have not been in the same system as your learning content. So you have to figure out how those are all going to work together. How you're going to be able to move students back and forth between doing assessments and doing learning content. One of the things that Western Governors does is use online proctoring. Is anybody familiar with online proctoring and how that works? Criterion and ProctorU, there are some companies out there that do that. And I told the folks yesterday, I was doing a demo of it, and they were asking me where I lived on a certain year, and I'm like, well, I know what house I lived in, but the post office changed my address 3 times a year. So there are really some interesting ways that they validate you are who you are. One of the funny things that happened too when I was at New Charter is we got a call from ProctorU, and they said there's a problem with this student. In the middle of the exam, the student went to sleep. So the student went to sleep in the middle of the exam. So the proctor at ProctorU is calling the student on the phone multiple times trying to wake the student up. So when they sent me the complaint, here is a video of the student sleeping. So there's some interesting ways, but they can tell, like if the student is looking away from the computer, they can tell if they're looking at their book, and they can tell if they're sleeping. The sleeping one was too funny though, because I had not ever seen that happen before. So you will publish you're going to have a system to launch and publish your assessments. You have to have a system for assigning faculty and getting faculty the right tools that they need. New Charter does have one of the nicest, they're building their systems in-house, and they did have some wonderful dashboards for faculty members to use where they could pull up and see, and they have these in Blackboard and eCollege also, where you can pull up and see how much time the student had spent in the course. You could see what they actually worked on in the course. So they had wonderful dashboards for both the advisors and for the faculty members to be able to tell what students were doing. All right, you have to make sure everybody can get to and is able to use the technology platforms. And then you have to train faculty and staff. Have you all tried to train faculty on new platforms before? Huh? That can be fun. That can be a lot of fun. So before you can actually launch a program, you've got to make sure everybody who needs to work in that system knows how to work in the systems. Also, you have to train administrators too to think differently about competency-based education and how, even for online programs that are non-traditional. You have to train your administrators and your administrative staff to think about the repercussions for that. One of the things that's been interesting working with some institutions that are trying to create parallel programs, and Jay probably knows this, is getting your academic policies in the catalog to agree with what you're actually doing with students, because some of the catalogs say, after week 3, you can no longer drop a class, or after, the middle of the term, you're going to get an F if you stop attending. Well, those things don't work when you have students starting at multiple times and finishing at multiple. It just doesn't work. So you have to revise and certainly look at all of your academic policies around student progress. All right. One of the last step in implementation is problem solving, because you will have issues. Something will not work. So you need to always allow time to be able to problem solve, because there will be some problems. Either your system won't work, or somebody can't get into the system, or your systems won't talk to each other. So there are always problems. You also need an evaluation process. So, and this is similar to any time you launch a new degree program. You need an evaluation process. So one of the things that you would monitor in a competency-based program would be the statistical performance of your pre-assessment exams and tests. Jay talked about pre-assessments a little bit. Western Governors gives a pre-assessment for every objective exam that students are required to take. So every student, when they come into what we'll call a course, although course is a dirty word at Western Governors, we never use the word course, but when you come into a course, you take a pre-assessment. So after that pre-assessment what you have to do to be able to master the competencies in that course to be able to pass that. And some schools are going to do pre-assessments for all courses. So pre-assessments are an important tool. They do help guide students on where to begin their work. The other thing that is, I think, going to be revolutionary when it comes to pass is adaptive learning. What's going to happen? Somebody's going to be able to do competency-based with adaptive learning, and when they can do that, that's going to be really revolutionary, I think, because you would come in, take your pre-assessment. The adaptive learning platform would design your learning plan based on your learning style and based on your scores on the pre-assessment. So I'm waiting for that to happen. I don't think it's that far off, but we're not quite there yet. You're going to monitor student progress, and you're going to monitor how quickly students are actually able to move through the content, because you're going to have red flags. With competency-based, it's an interesting thing, because it's an interesting phenomenon, because the longer students were at Western Governors, once they got past the 20-month mark, the less likely they were to graduate. Okay? So if a student were there 4 years, they were less likely to graduate. Because what happens is that it takes too long, and so students get burnt out. And a lot of times they've enrolled in a competency-based program because they think it's faster. They think the time to degree is going to be faster. But it was the opposite of what traditional higher education is, where with traditional higher ed, if you can get them to year 3 or year 4, you're very, very likely to graduate them. With Western Governors, once they got to year 3, the probability of them graduating goes down. So you're going to want to monitor student progress. You're going to want to find out where the bottlenecks are. Where are students getting stuck? Where are they having problems? You want to look at faculty performance. At both Western Governors and New Charter, the faculty supervisors have dashboards, and they know how your students are doing. You get evaluated on your students. When I worked at Western Governor, you got evaluated by the SAT, and retention of your students. So SAP, of course, you guys know, what is it called? I can't think of the exact name of it right now, but somebody knows that, right? Yeah, all right. Standards of Academic Progress. SAT was satisfaction, so they did a student satisfaction survey. So faculty get evaluated based on the student satisfaction survey. And then you got evaluated based on your student retention rates. So there are ways to monitor faculty performance. There were certainly arguments about that those weren't always good measures of faculty performance, but that's what they did at Western Governors. You're going to want to, if you use a disaggregated model where you have graders or evaluators that aren't your other faculty, you would want to monitor the quality of feedback that faculty provide to students on the assessments. With competency-based programs, assessment is a true key to making sure you're doing competency-based and doing it right. Our psychometrician at WGU used to always say, you're going to get sued over that, Pat, you're going to get sued. So you had to always be sure that you had very clear standards and you had Of course, grading rubrics for every project, every task had grading rubrics. You're going to want to also monitor the effectiveness of your learning content. So if you create courses of study, or perhaps you partner with a learning content provider, you're going to want it to know how much students engage in the learning content, how well they do after they engage in the learning content. So it's going to be important that you be able to get that type of feedback. Also, you're going to need to have a plan for curriculum maintenance. Every course I've ever launched, every program I've ever launched, there are glitches. There are problems. Has anybody launched a program with no problems? I want to know who they are. Somebody in here has got to have done it. There are always curriculum maintenance issues that have to happen, and so you have to allow time for that, and you have to also look for problems with your curriculum and where are students getting stuck? Where are the bottlenecks? You know, is there an assessment? At Western Governors, we had an assessment called College Level Reasoning and Placement Performance Test. It was about college level reasoning, and so, but students got stuck there. For some strange reason, students got stuck there in the curriculum, and so we revised the curriculum because students were having difficulty with that. Here are some potential challenges with building competency-based programs, and I don't think there's anything, a lot of these you've already heard of. I'm not sure there's a lot new here. One of the things I think that is very important that sometimes colleges and universities do not consider is, who are your students? Jay figured out who their students were. Competency-based programs cannot be everything to everybody. So you've got to figure out who are your students. Are your students a 35-year-old who works and who's female and has 2 children? You've got to figure out how that works. I think one of the challenges at New Charter was that they thought everybody was their student, and they also thought that people were going to see, and you know, they have open courses, which is very nice. I mean, it's great for providing information, but they thought students were going to look at the course and say, whoo, yay, I'm going to sign up for this course today. That's not how people make decisions around taking courses. You know, people go back to school when they have a reason to go back to school, or they've thought about it, they have a process. So you need to make sure you have a clear idea of who your students are, who your market is, who are you going after. Another potential challenge, which the 2 presenters before me have talked about, is you've got to have buy-in from faculty, staff, and administrators. If you have somebody who is not on your side, or not in your corner, they can derail your whole development process. I worked at, before I went to work for Western Governors, I worked for Old Dominion University. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Old Dominion, but, and I managed one of their distance learning sites that was way out in the southwestern part of the state where I live, which is not far from Jay, not far from Kentucky. And I wanted new signage for my office at the community college. And for 6 months, I talked to the administrator at the community college. I talked to the VP, who was supposed to be my contact. I had multiple visits with him. Finally, I asked the secretary down the hall, who had worked there for 30 years, I said, I want new signs for my office, but I can't get new signs. And so she said, you got to go talk to the president. I said, you have to talk to the president to get a new sign? And she said, yeah, he was the founding president. He had been there the whole time. He knew everything about everything, but no decisions were made without his involvement. So once I went and talked to him, I got new signs. But so, you know on your campus who those people are, or how the system works. So you need to make sure you figure out, if you're trying to introduce not just a competency-based program, but any new program, who are the gatekeepers? Who are the people you have to have on board? Also, financial aid, which we've already talked about. I think that's a struggle for everybody right now, trying to figure that out. Updating academic policies, which we've already talked about. A clear enrollment and advising policy, which Jay talked about a little bit. And also, with your enrollment folks, they have to be able to communicate what competency-based is. And one of the things we found at Western Governors is it takes more time to get a student enrolled, because you have to actually tell them and teach them what competency-based education is. So it takes a little while to get them through that process. You have to have flexibility in your student information system. If you want to enroll students next week, Is your registrar going to kill you, come after you with a hatchet? I used to be a registrar. I know what that's like. So you have to be careful because sometimes the student information system will not let you enroll students on, every Monday or every Friday. So you're going to have to be careful with that. Exam security is a real challenge. One of the reasons it's a real challenge is because exams are expensive to build. If you build them right and you tailor them to the competencies in your program, they're expensive to build. So you have to be really secure about that. One of the concerns at Western Governors, and the faculty who work with students on learning content at Western Governors are never allowed to see the test. They're never allowed to see the test because they want to avoid teaching to the test. And so that's something you have to be very careful of when you are in a competency-based model. One of the challenges, I think, at institutions, and it's certainly for competency-based, but probably also for all of you, everybody wants to pay for new development. Nobody wants to pay for maintenance and updating your programs. So you have to make sure you have money in the bank for that, or you have resources allocated for that. At Western Governors, I'll say this, we did not do a good job with remedial support for students. It was kind of come in and we'll provide we'll provide learning content and all that, but if you had really serious deficits in terms of needing help with remedial writing and remedial math, we had faculty members who worked with those students, but we really needed a better program for providing remedial support. So that was one of the challenges for us. I'll make sure you get my contact information. Do I have time for questions, or are we? Well, no questions now, but I'll be on the panel later, and catch me if you have questions. I'll be glad to talk to you about my experiences with competency-based.